Welcome to another episode of the AlbumReview.net podcast. I'm Greg Potters. Thanks to all you loyal listeners out there for your interaction and your feedback. Your feedback is much appreciated and it helps me to always improve. On today's episode, Clementine Moss joins me again, but this time for an in-depth, descriptive, and emotional review of George Harrison's 1970 debut album, All Things Must Pass. This is part one of a two-part review. I just had to break it into two parts. It was a really long conversation. Clem was a recent guest on episode number 51 of the podcast. She is the founding member and the drummer for the West Coast-based Led Zeppelin powerhouse tribute project, Zepparella. Clem is also a spiritual counselor and an author. She recently published a book, From Bonham to Buddha and Back. And you can check this out and pick up a copy of your own at either clementinemoss.com or clemthegreat.com. So whether you're a Beatles fan or not, All Things Must Pass, it really changed my perception of not only George Harrison, but of music. So sit back, or keep up that good pace if you're doing some exercise or washing the dishes right now, and enjoy part one of this two-part review of George Harrison's All Things Must Pass.
Sunrise doesn't last all morning. A cloudburst doesn't last all day. Seems my love is up and has left you with no warning. It's not always gonna be this great. All things must pass. All things must pass away.
How are things with you? How's the tour? I know you just recently you did Nashville, a couple places in Nashville. How's the tour been going?
Yeah, it was good. We had we had a couple weekends where we were kind of flying around, and then I had a week off, and then we went out to Nashville, and I stayed in Nashville during that week because my dear friend that I write songs with, Justin, he lives in Nashville, and so I hadn't seen his new house anything.
I think you mentioned that you had a really close friend there that kind of takes you around and
gives you
the new stuff. Cool.
Yeah, it was really cool. And we had a day off in Nashville, and we got to go get tours of Third Man Records.
Oh,
and,
nice.
And the Gibson factory and the Gibson.
Very
working.
cool.
Yeah.
How was that?
It was really cool. Gretchen, my guitarist, and my bass player went to the factory and got to see them actually assembling the guitars.
Wow.
And then I met them up at what they call the Gibson Garage, which is kind of their retail area. The business offices are upstairs, and we went up to the CEO's office, and he has
wow.
He has I know, it was amazing. I guess he was the one who was taking them all around the place to the factory, and then we met them back, and we went up to his office, and we're hanging out, and he has Mary Ford's guitar, which is actually basically the guitar that the Les Paul was created off of, right?
Oh my God.
And Gretchen sat and played it. I swear,
Wow.
I got really, really teary when she was playing it, because it was I felt this I just felt time,
Yeah.
from, this badass woman, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and then.
Yeah. And you're in the presence of that tangible thing. I mean, if I was in the presence of that guitar, I would have the same just
It
kind of
was
like, I
it
need
was
to sit
kind of
down.
emotional.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
sure.
it was kind of
Yeah.
emotional. And then Gretchen was just playing this beautiful,
Oh,
like playing
did the
so
guitar
beautifully.
sound, I mean, despite its
Sounded so good.
history, did it
No,
really?
no,
Oh,
it
man.
sounded so good. I didn't know the story of it, but I guess her nephew or something, Mary Ford's nephew, sold it on eBay for like $7,000 or
Wow.
something. And then Gibson,
Surprised that's it.
yeah. And then Gibson was like, hey, wait a minute. Like, we need that.
Yeah,
Right? Give that over here.
very
And kind of
cool.
saved it. Yeah. So
Yeah.
it was a really special day.
Awesome.
Yeah. They had
Awesome.
a Rush pinball machine.
Oh,
Yeah.
very nice.
I was thinking of that
So
because you just
cool.
put out your Rush
Yes.
episode.
Very up
Yeah.
my alley. Yes,
Yeah.
for sure. That is awesome. Well, I've been renting out the studio. I have the one we did the last pod, you and I, was in my house, but
Mm.
this one is not too far down the street. So I've been using this a little bit over the last couple of weeks to record episodes. So
Mm.
it's nice. Well, yeah, I was doing some recap, some little bit of homework, and this morning got up and all I've been doing all day besides work is just been listening to the album again.
When I was listening to the record and just like kind of reading about it and making notes, I was like, God, Greg is so good at like talking about the specifics of the musicality. I'm the kind of person who never really paid attention to who played on what, or you know what I mean? Like, it's not my brain. But I do like talking about like just like the meaning of things. And since we had such a like kind of spiritual connection, I thought that this album would be a
Totally.
good opportunity to kind of delve into some of that stuff. So.
Yeah. Yeah. So after the calamitous divorce of the Beatles, lead guitarist George Harrison finally had an opportunity to release a compilation of songs that he'd been writing and presenting to the band for several years. A man who many thought, including other members of the Beatles, was an undervalued talent. Harrison recorded his album All Things Must Pass, his first solo album, with producer Phil Spector at Abbey Road Studios. Released on September 27th, 1970, it ended up as a triple album. And so consumers were gifted with 3 black vinyl records that slid swiftly in and out of the album jacket. Just picture it. In, out. Aside from the Woodstock concert LP, it was considered the very first triple studio album ever released, which I found really cool. Much of this album was recorded live, with the original studio version also containing a bonus vinyl disc, including Apple Jams with songs such as It's Johnny's Birthday, Plug Me In, and Out of the Blue. And I'm going to get into a lot of these songs in a moment, but again, wanted to introduce my friend and guest, Clementine Moss. Clem, how's it going?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I bought this album because they just came out with the 50-year anniversary.
Yeah.
I thought I had it in here with me, but so it seemed like kind of the perfect thing to talk about, since you and I both like are really interested in spiritual stuff, and George is maybe one of the most vocal spiritual rock and rollers of the 70s, right?
I was really delighted when I, dug deeper into the Beatles, when I really got into my phase decades ago, to learn a lot more about George. And then we were just talking about the 2011 documentary Living in a Material World, and I was practically brought to tears when I saw that, just because, I mean, not only just the way that George ended up passing away to lung cancer, but just also how it was funny. Like, I didn't in any way, nor did I want to hate Paul and John, but I had feelings sometimes of like, especially when I saw that Let It Be, or not, was it Let It Be? No, I'm sorry. It was the Get Back documentary that was on Disney Plus
Right.
a couple Thanksgivings ago. I remember that whole weekend. I just
I did
watched
too.
that.
I did that too. I did that too.
It was like 7 hours, and I just
Oh yeah,
kept,
it was so great.
oh my gosh. But I remember seeing that and thinking like, why don't they give him more, more? And they did, but they also, I mean, Paul was just such a machine when it came to like getting things going. And it seemed like when they went into the studio, Paul was like, let's go, let's go, let's go, let's go. Whereas, and I heard an interview with Ringo a couple months ago where he was like, during that session, I was just there. And whenever they would start jamming and throwing something together, I would just put a drum beat on it. So I was kind of always ready. Whereas the rest of the guys were like, yeah, I'm not feeling it right now. I want to go have a cup of tea, or I'm not feeling it right now. I want to go, go take a walk outside or something like that. But with
Yeah.
George, yeah, I mean, there was so much music inside him, and most, if not all, the songs that were George songs that were put on different Beatles records, I think, were all classics. But God, when he had the opportunity to put out a solo record, I was like, man, like, what would it have been like? And then it dawned on me, these aren't just people fanboying out or fangirling out or fanning out. This was really the biggest supergroup when you put it all together. And I found it interesting that out of all, I think the first of the 3 solo albums, the first one that was done by Paul, first that was done by John, and then this was the most successful from a sales standpoint. You might have owned this. Like I said, it wasn't until 2002 that I was turned on to this record. And so I feel like a really late bloomer. Do you remember the first time, or around the first time that you heard it?
I don't think so, but I'm sure that my father had it because, my father was a really big rock and roll lover.
Yeah.
Loved the Beatles and the Stones. So he had it. So this record was around a lot. I don't remember it being in the same kind of rotation as some of the other records. And so listening to it through, for when I bought the 50-year anniversary, it was kind of, some of the songs were a surprise, like, oh, like I didn't even really realize that was on, like whatever I was listening to. I think it was probably those end songs that you're talking about, the jam ones. I
Yeah.
don't really remember listening to those that much. I think I was captivated by the lyrics a lot.
Sure.
And then when you're talking about the documentary of the Beatles, having been in bands for the last 30 something years,
Right.
I was just like, I could feel what everybody was I felt like I had been each of those people.
Totally.
Because in bands, when they fracture, and I'm not talking about my current band because my Zepparella as it
I know what you
is
mean.
is lovely, but long ago, just being in bands where like there's factions, right? And I was watching John and Paul, and they just had that electric
Yeah.
energy between them.
Yeah.
And it feels like, of course, George had to be on the outside of that,
Totally.
and
You could see it. You could just see it.
you could see it. And I
Yeah.
remember when George's like, I'm out of here. And then John and Paul are like, we got to go get him. And then they all go to his house. I was like, oh my God, I feel like I have been in that
Yeah.
situation, So
Yeah.
that's what I really loved, is just, this is just a band, right? These are just people who are in a creative relationship, and all of the little, like, you never really understand all of the tiny little slights and injuries that people who are in creative situations kind of take on. So
Yeah. I always
reading about
wondered.
reading about this, and George just feeling free, and I
Totally.
feel a lot of freedom in this album for him.
Absolutely, because it's kind of all over the place, right? And he has a lot of guest stars on the album. Eric Clapton, which we all know of. He plays guitar and he sings on a bunch of different songs. That I was looking back, the song I Remember Jeep. It was
Mhm.
actually named after Clapton's dog.
I
Clapton,
saw that.
for those listening to this that don't know, Clapton and George were extremely good friends. So much so that and Clem, keep me honest here, but I'm pretty sure I have this story right. When Clapton fell in love with Patty, George's wife, he kind of went to George and was like, I've got a problem. I'm in love with Patty. And George confronted Patty, and Patty was like, I've got a problem too. I'm in love with Eric. And instead of being like, screw you guys, he was like, well, I support if you two are in love. I'm sure it wasn't an easy overnight thing. George had to swallow it, and he probably went through some sadness and depression, but he didn't want to lose his relationship with both Eric and Patty. And so he was like, well, if you two are happy together, and obviously, if I remember correctly, Clapton wrote Layla after,
That's right.
because of his love of
Yeah.
Patty. But it's
Yeah.
just like,
Well, I think you can hear in this album that he's kind of talking to breakup in some ways.
yeah,
In one way, he's talking to the divine through the lover, right?
Right.
In a lot of these songs. But there are songs I feel where he's, that feel like he's kind of trying to get back to some feeling or something.
it's kind of like his diary.
Yeah.
Or something like that. So
It is.
I also found out that not only was, Clapton and several others, but Ginger Baker,
I saw that.
Cream,
Yeah.
those are in some of the blues jams that are on the I believe it's the third disc or the third LP. So for people who, because I actually had enjoyed, I've listened to the first record several times, but I went back and really geeked out on the bluesy, jammy record this time around. And that's when I learned that Ginger Baker actually played on it, and just there's a bunch of blues jams on there that, if you like blues jams, you've got to listen to this. But so this album was produced by Phil Spector, and for any of those out there who don't know Phil Spector, just Google him and watch the documentary. I think it was HBO that they did a documentary only a few years back on Phil Spector. What an interesting character, and I believe he's dead now, but yeah, interesting guy, but a musical genius, many would say. He was known for creating the wall of sound. As I mentioned, he's quite mad, to quote John Lennon. I think there was a story that John said one day, it was while they were recording one of Lennon's solo records, and Phil was mad at somebody else in the room, and he pulled out one of his guns and shot the ceiling. And the only person in the room that stood up was Lennon, and Lennon was like, Phil, if you do that crap again, I'm ending my relationship with you. Put the gun away. It's like, if that happened today, that guy'd be in jail. Like, it's just, I love that story. And I love how I could picture Phil Spector like, sorry, John, sorry about that. And then they just like continued because they both knew how special they each were from a musical standpoint. But anyway, Phil Spector, he's known for producing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of albums, and if I'm correct, I believe he's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame despite his madness. But the Wall of Sound, the approach was, this was really the nucleus of the Wall of Sound. Spector recorded the backing tracks live, with tracks ranging from several guitars, 2 to 3 drummers at one point, and more than one keyboard player. So instead of just recording a track and then bouncing it and putting it on top of another one, he just had several drummers going at the same time and several guitar players recording at the same time. So when you think about it, to each their own. And some may, you have a lot more recording experience than I do, Clem. It's been a couple of years since I've recorded in the studio, but I think that when you think about this, it creates somewhat of a deeper, wider surround sound that, at least at the time, 1970, when this came out, few producers were searching for or even doing. I read that the musicians were all set up in a circle with Harrison in the middle, in many cases Clapton with him in the middle playing the guitars. And I think when you listen to this album, you can really hear that full sound mixed with the echo of multiple instruments. Did you ever record this way, Clem, in any of your
I have tried to record, I like recording as live as possible, as many instruments live as possible, because it just, you get the mojo, right? If I go in and just record a drum track and then record a bass track and then record a guitar track on top of it, it doesn't have that same magic of people in a room.
Totally agree.
Yeah. Now that said, like, some of my favorite songs on this album are the cleaner sounding ones, right? The more simple sounding ones. I feel like George's songwriting, his guitar playing, and his voice, like, when they're just simply there, it's kind of magic, So, and some of the stuff on this album, I can really feel that kind of 70s, like Tom Jones kind of like show tune kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
A little bit. And I feel like that might be because there was just so much going on. And
there was a lot. It was kind of busy.
Busy,
I would say a little bit. Yeah, that's interesting. There's one of my favorite tracks, Wah Wah, which I want to get to in a minute. As much as I love it, when I first heard it, I couldn't get over how I felt like Phil Spector just turned the treble all the way up.
Yeah.
And the bass all the way down.
Right.
And such a stark contrast from what I'm used to today. I mean, even these headphones that I have now, like they're like triple bass Bose, they're meant to kick in the bass, and yet Spector's sound was different. So as I mentioned before, when I was introduced to this album in 2002, a close friend of mine, he said, take the Beatles and Pink Floyd and put them in a blender and out comes All Things Must Pass. So for people out there that haven't heard it, even if you admire the Beatles, even if you don't, just take a listen. It's important to understand, as Clem and I were talking about earlier, George Harrison's angst and his kind of growing disappointment with really not having as many songs as he wanted included in a lot of the Beatles records. But when you go back and listen to When My Guitar Gently Weeps and My Sweet Lord and oh God, Clem, help me out on some of the other ones. Like they're all
Isn't It a Pity?
classics. Isn't It a Pity? I mean, the ones that wound up on Beatles records and they are really
the ones that
the ones that ended up on Beatles records. I feel like they're all so.
While My Guitar Gently Weeps.
Guitar Gently Weeps is one of my favorites, and you can just feel how different that is from Obla D, Obla Da, and a lot of the other tracks, Rocky Raccoon on the White Album. Yeah, so but by 1970, so we were talking earlier about 1969 was when the Get Back sessions were recorded, and I believe they were preparing to release Let It Be, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And by 1970, George had enough, and basically he spent 6 months compiling a list of musicians for his first album, including Ringo Starr, Beatles drummer, obviously, Clapton, as we mentioned. I also noticed Klaus Voormann, who Klaus has been on a lot of Beatles stuff and has played on a lot of different records throughout the 60s and 70s. Peter Frampton, I did not know until I did some deeper diving. And then Phil Collins was also a part of this. So I was mentioning Wah Wah, one of my favorite tracks. And I think the song begins instantly with a riff that you can pick up on.
Give me
quite different from George's Indian sitar sound that he cultivated through a bunch of the Beatles albums. But Wah Wah is a really fast rock song, and it's interesting to mention that because for some reason, like I said, it seems like Phil Spector turned the treble all the way up and the bass all the way down. And I really felt like, despite the fact that it's one of my favorites, it kind of lacks body.
Yeah.
But regardless of that, I think the song still kicks ass. And I think the rhythm and the beat continue to come full circle. They stop, pick back up, and this addictive guitar riff that just puts you back into the body of the song. And again, like I said, during the now famous Get Back sessions that were in Twickenham, if I'm pronouncing that right, in West London, Awa, I guess, was inspired by George's frustration during those sessions, specifically with Paul, over the song choices. And you can actually see in the documentary, Clem, where I think it was All Things Must Pass amongst a couple other songs where George is kind of jamming out and they're sort of humoring him a little bit. And then at one point, Paul's like, all right, let's get back to work.
Yeah.
George is like, I thought we were. Like, I thought that's what we were doing. So, but George writes, wah, wah. You've given me a wah, wah. W-A-H, W-A-H. Kind of like what I used to say to my brother when we were little kids and he would fall and start crying. I would go, wah, wah. I was such a mean older brother. And then he writes, wah, wah, you've given me a wah, wah, and I'm thinking of you and all the things we used to do. So apparently that was written in the inspiration of kind of directing that right at Paul. But I don't know. Was this a song that resonated with you or not?
Well, yeah, I really always loved it musically, but the words irritated me. Right? You know what I mean? But
I do.
When I was reading about this song for this podcast, I saw that Wawa means headache, right? Like he was intending it like headache, like you're giving me a headache. And actually, once I heard that,
Cool.
Yeah, it kind of made me understand it more. You know, like I was hearing it kind of the way that you were hearing it, like you're such a baby kind of thing. But when I heard like, you're just giving me a headache.
That makes more sense because I was like, you're giving me a wah-wah. Yeah. And I don't think I put two and two together though. So I say, hey, that's why we have multiple people on the pod to do reviews so we can learn things from each other. So, Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, and another thing too about this record, which it always knocks me out about every Beatles album, every Lennon album, every McCartney album, is the bass. Like, how do they get the bass to sound like butter?
Right.
Like, how does it sound like that?
Kidding.
And even in this song, where you're right, like the treble is kind of wonky in this song. I think that it's meant to be. I think it sounds different to us than it did at the time. I think at the time it probably sounded super rock, rock and roll. They're trying to get that like, noisy guitar sound, I guess. But through all of it, the bass is just so, and that's Klaus, right?
That's Klaus. Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that because Klaus and Clapton loved the sound when Spector played it for them, like the sound quality. I mean, they all love the song, but they loved the sound, and Harrison hated it. And apparently Klaus and Eric just spent a couple hours convincing George, no, this is good. And finally, George relented and said, "Okay, all right, fine. Let's do it like that." So, interesting. But you're right. You mentioned the lyrics. I think George's lyrics, not just on this song, but on all the songs, they just bleed into your ear. They're so heartfelt. And in reading more about George and seeing the Living in a Material World documentary, I learned that he really became a very spiritual man after the Beatles decided to stop touring. So that was 1966. I believe it was August of 66 was their last show. And George, he valued life experiences. His family and friends were especially important to him, so much so that he reacted unlike most any individual would. Like we talked about, his close friend Eric Clapton had told him he'd fallen for George's wife, Patty, who Clapton later wrote the song Layla about him. And Harrison's reaction was, well, let love take them where it was meant to go. I mean, I I don't know whether, if I was George's friend, I don't know whether I would have been like, punch him in the face, George, or if I would have been like, George, you are the most beautiful person for just being like, hey, let love take its course. And I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't know if this happened to me, I don't know what kind of reaction I would have. I guess it would take a little while to get over it. And I wouldn't expect my wife to be like, oh, I support you, whatever. I just recently finished the autobiography of Jan Wenner from Rolling Stone, who I think there's a lot of differences of opinion out there. A lot of people kind of think he's a schmudge, but I think he's interesting. Obviously, his biography was interesting, but he approached his wife of 20, 25 or something like years after they got married, and told her he was gay. And part of the book was just her coming to grips with that. And she spent years just really being angry. And then finally she said, you know what? I'll always love you and I'll always support you. And in 90% of the family pictures, after Jan came out of the closet and actually started dating a man and marrying a man, the wife's in the picture as well, supporting them. So I thought that was beautiful. It's like her love went beyond, I'm sounding a little cheesy here, but it's the way I feel. I think she went beyond her ego, and, had a level of maturity to say, I still love him as a human and I'm going to support what he does. And it seemed like that was hard for him. And I'm sure it was hard for George Harrison to say, hey, yeah, follow your heart, go wherever you want to go. But I think this adds to George's uniqueness, Clem.
Well, yeah, and it really, so when you think about this album as being kind of his breakthrough, like moving away from his old life into this new identity of, solo musician and spiritual person, right? Because so in 66 he met Ravi Shankar, right?
Right.
And started getting interested in the sitar, and then very quickly found Hinduism. And some of the tenets in Hinduism is that, every being is divine, right? Everything is divine. We're all like little pieces of the divine. And everything is love, right? So for George to have been, for the past 4 years, been deeply opening to this belief that everything here is, in a way, an illusion, kind of masking this bigger truth, which is that everything ultimately is divine, everything is God. Would he really be somebody who would punch somebody in the face? Because love was, it's like you really do kind of understand that. And he's George Harrison. Like he's not, he doesn't have a hard time getting dates, right?
That's a good point. That is a very, very good point. Yes. It's funny. Yeah. And you gotta think that like a lot of celebrities are probably like, yeah, you know what? I'm Paul McCartney, or I'm George.
Yeah.
I think I'll be okay.
I'm kind of amazed that those guys, a lot of those older rockers from England, actually were with their people for a really long time. I mean, it's kind of shocking. Like you don't really see that in celebrities these days, where they really have the stick-to-itness that a long marriage really takes.
You're absolutely right.
Kind of did.
And I think that was what was unique about those guys, is they really were. When I was thinking about this album earlier, the way I felt about George when I saw the Living in a Material World documentary, I felt the same way that I did when I dug deep into the Beach Boys and learned more about Brian Wilson, and how in many ways he's still a little kid. Now, unfortunately, George has passed and he's been gone now for 22 years, but Brian is still with us, and Brian he's just like this lost child out there, and all he really wants to do is be with friends and listen to music and talk about how he feels. And so I feel like I don't know, I feel like the Beatles were less of that. They had their moments, of course, but they were less of that celebrity, yeah, I'm really special and you're not. Whereas today you see a lot more of that, and you can see it all over TV. I mean, hell, there are TV shows of people that apparently we're supposed to think they're celebrities, and all they've really, they were married to someone who was kind of a celebrity. They were like, they were married to somebody who knew someone who was on Dancing with the Stars. And now all of a sudden they're on a show and we're supposed to stop and stare when they walk into a restaurant. Do you know who that is? That goes back to the age old theory that I had. It's like, if you put just a watermelon on TV, you have a channel that runs 24/7 with just a watermelon. And then one day that watermelon is being displayed behind a velvet rope at a museum. People are going to be like, wow, that's the watermelon. That's the one.
That's a little cynical now, Greg. Well, on this album, George writes to the fans, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, I know we're probably going to get there down the road, but he writes a love song, a little love ode to the what are they called? The Apple right?
Scruffs. Yep.
Yeah. The people who for years really
Love
took care of the Beatles in a way, and here's George who's separated from the band, but really appreciating, all of the people, writing an ode to the people who really were with them the whole time.
It's funny you mentioned Apple Scruffs. Some of the other, I think, must-hear classics on the album. I don't think we have time to get into every single solitary one because this would be like an 8-hour podcast, but jumping around a little bit, but the Ballad of Sir Frankie Crisp, Let It Roll.
Mm-hmm.
My three favorites, I mentioned Wah Wah, but Run of the Mill, I Live for You, and then, of course, the title track, All Things Must Pass. I think these are truly exceptional, just beautiful songs, Clem. And after experiencing, loss in my family, this album touches me more than it ever did when I first heard it 20 some years ago. And I guess maybe I was living under a rock. I don't know. But talking about Run of the Mill, specifically, I think the lyrics are outstanding. It opens up with everyone has choice when to and not to raise their voices. I remember this song, Clem, every time I'm in a situation where my patience is wearing thin. I'm reminded of George's words where he's, really guided and helped me become a better person. And he wrote yet another song inspired, I think, by his frustration with his bandmates in the Beatles. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that this is definitely a song that he's speaking to the friendship that they connected with. I feel like there's hidden meanings in this song that I don't quite, I think he's speaking directly to situations in this.
Yeah. I'm Greg Potters with albumreview.net. Are you looking to start your own podcast? I can save you a ton of time and money by helping you launch, publish, and grow your podcast. So this includes things like finding the equipment, the software, and tips and tricks that are going to be right for you and your budget. Also, if you're looking for things like editors, designers, or you just want to find out what the best platform to use is, that's what I do. So you can find me at albumreview.net or message me directly at gpotters@albumreview.net. there's another track, I Live For You, which begins with Pete Drake's ear-catching pedal steel guitar note that really falls back into a sweet, smooth, full-sounding verse rhythm.
All alone in this world of mine, not a care for this world have I. Only you keep my eyes open wide. Yes, it's true, I live for you. Not a thing in this world do I own, only sadness from all that has grown. In this darkness I wait for the day. Yes, it's true, I live for you.
Phil Spector's production and mixing here is magnificent. I don't know what happened on Wah Wah. Each instrument is really equal, including Harrison's vocals. And unlike Wah Wah, it sounds like George is yelling over louder, overpowering sounds, but still love it. Interestingly enough, I Live For You was not part of the original release, I learned.
Oh, really?
George added it to the package during the 30th anniversary re-release of the album in 2001.
Huh.
And so that was the copy that I got.
Ah.
And so I just assumed that had been part of the original. But if you go back and look, and I think it's hard to find. If you pull it up on some of the music platforms online now, I think, they all have I Live For You on there. But
Right.
still, this song holds the album together as its sound, energy, its love and swing really eases your soul with the pedal steel sound that's created by Pete Drake. That's really not on any other track. Do you have any specific feelings about this song?
I have all of my little lyrics here, so I'm kind of
Cool.
looking to see what the lyrics of this one are. I'm always really bad at it, like
Sorry.
and switch, so I might have to come back to it.
Okay, no worries.
See
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
I wanted to touch upon All Things Must Pass. I wanted to make sure that this episode does not complete without about this song, because
yeah, we have to talk about
this song now brings me pretty much to tears every time I hear it. So it's one of those
Yeah.
songs. It's like the Seinfeld episode when Elaine is dating that guy and he hears Desperado, and he just stares off into the abyss. And Elaine's like, "Are you with me?" And that's how I get when this song comes on. And then, not to take away from this album, but when I heard, oh my gosh, the goosebumps are already forming. When I heard this version on A Concert for George, which Paul and Ringo put together along with a lot of other artists at the Royal Albert Hall in 2002, it was done exactly 1 year to the day that he passed away, November 29th, 2002. When I hear Paul's version of All Things Must Pass, when he opens with, sunrise doesn't last all morning, the cloudburst doesn't last all day.
Sunrise doesn't last all morning. A cloudburst doesn't last all day. Seems my love is up and has left you with no warning. It isn't always gonna be this great. All things must pass. All things must pass away. Sunset doesn't last all evening. A mind can blow the clouds away. After all this, my love is up and must be leaving. It isn't always gonna be this way. All things must pass. All things must pass away. All things must pass. None of life's strings can last. So I must be on the way to face another day. Now the darkness only lasts nighttime. In the morning it will fade away. The daylight is good at arriving at the right time. It isn't always gonna be this way. All things must pass. All things must pass away. All things must pass. All things must pass away.
It just it brings me to tears. To add insult to injury, this was also the name of a Colin Hanks 2015 documentary about the birth, the dominance, and then the depressing demise of Tower Records.
Oh,
You know, I don't know about you, but like I grew up with, I'm sure you did too. Like I grew up
Yeah.
with Tower Records. That's what I went. That's where I went.
yeah. There was
Um,
one right down the street from me here in San Francisco when I moved here.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
we had one in Boston, and we had one right outside the city. And I used to tell my parents that I was going over to my friend's house to play basketball, and we jumped on the subway. We took it into Boston, and we spent 3 hours at Tower Records. And going to Tower Records in the 70s, 80s, and 90s was like going to an amusement park. It was
Yeah.
pleasure overload. I know in the last podcast, Clem, we talked about
People who go to record stores and
yes, Clem,
place
how it's
over, and I
not
was
your-
like, I like go down the road and like have margaritas at the Mexican place, and then come back.
Well,
You
that
know?
was me. I know your husband's like that. That
Yeah,
was
he
that
is.
was me. Amoeba. That's what we were talking about.
Oh, Amoeba. That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So Tower is probably the closest. Excuse me, Amoeba is probably the closest thing to Tower.
Yeah, that's
But
right.
but yeah, I found it. You know, Colin Hanks deliberately chose that song. All things must pass. Obviously, so. If anyone out there, Clem, including yourself, if you haven't had a chance to see that documentary, you definitely should
Yeah.
check it
Yeah,
out.
I need to.
George's,
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, George's lyrics deal with the fleeting nature of human existence and the harsh reality that indeed all good things do come to an end. So,
Well, you know, when we were kind of talking about talking about this album and thinking that I'm not really, you know, even though I've been a musician for a long time, I'm not the kind of person who ever like really figured out who like all of the people who played on albums and stuff. And, you know, I'm not really specific in my music listening like that.
mhm.
But the one thing that I really love about this album is the idea that we're writing to we're writing love songs to people, friendships and partners, but he's also writing to the divine, right? To his understanding of spirituality and of God. And in Hinduism and in Buddhism, I know that, you know, the idea that everything passes is actually the practice, right? Because,
Yeah.
you know, we sit and, you know, I studied, you know, I've been meditating as a Vipassana meditator for 30 years or so. And
Right.
the practice is to sit and observe sensations, observe what rises and falls, and realize that if you cannot react or watch your reaction and fall into that place that is able to observe your reactions to things, then you realize that, if this time there's a pain in my shoulder and I don't react to it, I don't, move my shoulder or sit a different way, I just observe it and then move on. The next time I come to the shoulder, it's going to feel different, or it might feel the same, right? I mean, this is the basic practice. And in doing this kind of non-reactive sitting, what happens is you end up opening this wider awareness of realizing that which always stays.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so, in a sense, all things must pass. To me, it's not a sorrowful thing. It's a joyful thing, because
I love this.
all of these things that rise and fall, everything does change. I mean, the Clem who's talking to you now is a different Clem who's talking to you now, because my molecules have changed, my blood has moved. Everything is constantly in change. And I really feel that if we can really embrace our idea that everything changes and that we are here to find that which never changes, that open awareness of that bigger vibration that we're all a part of, I think it can be very comforting in times when, we are met with deep grief and real trouble. And I find it really feels like the people who suffer the most are those who are really looking to get to something that's been lost, and they can't move past the loss, and they hold on to the loss. And often, some of the times where I've freaked out the most about changing my life, those times, many times, bring me to a place of, better too.
Yeah. I love
in
this.
a lot of ways.
I love this. This is going to turn into a therapy session, you helping me, because, Clem, every time, part of what's difficult for me to listen to this song is I think about, the grass. And I don't like this, but I look at a certain person or thing or place, and I'm like, that's going to be over at some point. And I'm working through that. I'm talking to a lot of people and trying to get over this, but that's been difficult for me as I've experienced loss. I just recently lost a friend a week and a half ago who's younger than I am, 42. So he's 4 years younger than me, and I couldn't listen to music for a couple days afterwards. And I mean, I think that's understandable, but look, the way that you just phrased that, I was like, I've been driving around on an empty tank of gas for the last 2 weeks, and you just filled my tank and gave me like an extra battery so that when that tank runs out, I can keep going. I mean, you're so right. And that's just such a healthier, more beautiful way of looking at it. And when you put it that way, it makes so much more sense to me than I think if I had just read it somewhere.
Well, and
so thank you.
Yeah, and your friend is here, right? I mean, the physical is gone, but your friend, I mean, in that deep love, I mean, that's here. It's present. And I love the idea that maybe our idea of time is completely, like, maybe time is not linear. Maybe everything happens in one moment. This is kind of a Hindu idea way of seeing things, Eastern way of seeing things. If everything is in one moment, then we're all here together always. And it's through love that we can make that connection. That love of your friend. He is always present with you. That is the eternal that we find where we really look.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I struggle with is the fear of the unknown, that I think we all have. But we might have talked about this in the last podcast you and I did together. But I think as a kid, I sort of was given this, I grew up Catholic, and and that was just, there wasn't a choice. That was
Mhm.
just what I was,
I did too.
I turned 5 years
Yeah.
old, and I was wearing a plaid tie, and I was going to St. John's School every
Mhm.
day.
Mhm.
And
Mm.
so I had this vision of, the afterlife, and that there really was no end, and that it was actually going to be even sweeter. And as I've gotten older, there have been some chips in that block, for lack of a better way of saying it. And I think when I listen to a song like All Things Must Pass, it's so beautiful. I think it really is my favorite song on the record. But I also, it brings back this fear.
Mm.
And what it's started to do is, even in joyful situations, I look at it like, oh, this is going to be over
Mhm.
someday,
Mhm.
someday soon. And so I want to do everything I can to hold on to it. And
Mm.
I think I'm constantly striving to get through that and look at it more from, a different perspective, because time is short, life is short, and the clock is kind of ticking, so to speak. And more so now, music to me has such a huge effect on me that I want to hold on to it, and I don't ever want to let it go. And so when I was listening to this record today, again, just kind of getting excited about it, I put myself back in the place. I don't know if you do this, but I always go back to where I was when I first heard it. And it's
Mhm.
so odd. Like, I can remember certain things that I saw during a particular part of the song. I used to ride the subway a lot to work back then, and I had my old Sony Discman with me,
Mhm.
and I
Mhm.
was so excited. This was well before the iPod, and I would throw the disc in and listen to it and look out the window. And so listening to this record kind of brings a lot of that back again. And then so I'm I feel like I'm forced to reminisce and think back to those times. And what I'd much rather do is listen to the music for what it is, and have it be something that gets me excited for the future. And I'm not trying to say I'm not excited about the future, but in the last podcast I did about Rush's Roll the Bones, I'm paraphrasing what I said, but it was something to the effect of, like, I remember as a kid, I didn't think about death. I didn't think about school shootings. I'm getting real deep here, but I didn't think about politics. I just thought about my friends, and I thought about my family, and I thought about how excited I was for dinner, and how excited I was after school to go back up to my room, and I wanted to learn how to play Black Dog on my bass, and I wanted to learn how to play Stairway to Heaven on my
Mhm.
guitar. And that's all I thought about. And now today, as an adult, um, I think about a lot of the what ifs and a lot of the tragedies. And music, sometimes, as wonderful as it is, can bring back some of those bad memories as well, even though it was a good memory when I first listened to it. I don't know if any of
Mhm.
this makes sense, but
Yeah.
um, I just I
Yeah.
love listening to your point of view with everything, because I think it's so genuine, and this isn't something that you're just saying for show. Because I feel like a lot of times people, they they do that just to kind of make you feel better. I'm guilty of that sometimes. My wife will have a tough day, and I'll just start
Try to fix.
spewing
Yeah.
this positivity, and then
Yeah.
when I'm done, I'm like, I only really believed in like half of that, but I'm not going to say that. Uh, I want, my goal is to cheer her up. I don't want to see her sad, and she does the same for me.
Right.
But when it's coming from you, I just feel like it's so genuine, like you really feel it. Um, so
I mean, there are all things, that I felt deeply, the
yeah,
great agony of
right.
change,
You were there. I mean, you
the
did.
great agony of things. I have moments in my life where I stood and said, just remember, like, remember what this feels like here. Remember what this is right here.
Yeah,
And over time, I realized, first of all, that thing you were talking about of really just being in the moment and being so distracted by the fact that things are going to change, you know. when you think about, the idea of mindfulness, right, and be here
Right.
now,
Right.
and not getting caught in the future, caught in the past, and just being able to fully be in your moments. I think that it really is, when you're thinking about, you know, solidify this so that you can remember it forever. What you're doing is you're robbing yourself of the experience, because you really are living in the future. You're living in the time where it doesn't exist, and you're trying to go back to that moment. And so when you accept that all things will pass, and yet there is something here that is eternal. I mean, a Hindu, a Buddhist, they believe that we're back a lot, right?
Right.
And even if we
Definitely.
don't come back here, there is that spark that exists, right? And I think to see everything as that spark, that lighter place that you imagine, it's here. We're here, right? We're here already. It is present. And so in, our practice, what we do is watch how we pull ourselves into the past or future to rob ourselves of really feeling the pain, feeling the grief, really feeling, but also being able to, when we allow those things to rise, most of the time, we're not given anything we can't handle, right, emotionally. So we allow the grief to rise. And if we don't tell ourselves a story like this is going to stay forever, or this person is gone and all of this stuff, we're not telling the story and we're just feeling that fully. What's underneath it is that wide awareness of continuation of that. And when you think about that 5-year-old boy, or that young person listening to those albums, he's alive. He's alive in you. You are it.
Yeah.
You look at the world through that lens, and everything that you bring to this moment is recognizing that, all things are here at once.
Yeah. God, I never
Yeah.
even looked at it that way, but now I think when I hear the song now that I will, because you're right. When I broke my leg last summer, and I was in bed for 6 weeks, and then I started to have feelings that I might never, run again, or I had crazy feelings like I might never walk again. I think that had a lot to do with the pain meds I was taking. But you're right. It's all things must pass, and look at it from that perspective. This is why I love doing this, because, well, I could go on and on and on for so many reasons. So,
Well, I mean, you always take it there.
yeah,
That's the great thing. That's why I really love this, and why I was so excited to do this
yeah,
album, because I see George Harrison as, I know there was a lot going on, in the 60s and 70s and 50s, 60s and 70s to kind of bring
right,
Eastern spirituality to the West, and and he just seemed to speak from that pure place, which is that
yeah,
if you really move in a meditation all the way down, releasing all your reactions, what's left is that vibration of love.
yeah,
And I've been thinking lately, what if I just saw everything as love in all its forms, right? Love as love, forgetting it's love, right?
right,
In the, in the worst parts of what I'm looking at. But what if I recognized that vibration of love at the base of everything? Then what does the world look like? Then how do I see the jerky guy who's being a jerk, right? Then,
right.
I see him as having forgotten that, and what a painful thing it must be to
Yeah,
forget that we are here vibrating in this love. When you look at all of the, thousands and thousands and thousands of after-death experiences of people who died and were brought back,
right.
like
So many.
every single person says, I was just surrounded in more love than I ever knew.
Yeah,
Right?
that's a great point, Clem. Yeah,
Yeah, and that is here, right? So I don't know. I think that the sorrow and the suffering that we go through, they're great teachers for us, for what we hold on to we hold on to our suffering a lot of the times because it's the only thing we've known, and we think that it's comforting in a way.
Right.
I wrote something in my book about, when I am in grief, I see, like, if I sit and I just allow grief to rise and I feel it, and it's like a physical reaction that comes up in me. Then when it starts to dissipate, I see myself clutching for it, like wanting to tell myself the story, because if the grief only lasts for 2 minutes, then am I really that sad? Am I the person who is really sad?
Right.
We identify with the sad. I am now suffering. I am now grief. And these practices, that Harrison was doing and that you do, the meditation, that's part of some of the lessons we have.
So I must be on my way. I face another day. Now the darkness only stays at night time. In the morning it will fade away. Daylight is good at arriving at the right time. It's not always gonna be this great. All things must pass. All things must pass away. All things must pass. None of life's dreams can last. So I must be on my way. Face another day. Now the darkness only stays at night.
Thanks again for listening to the albumreview.net podcast. And today's episode, part 1 of a 2-part review of George Harrison's 1970 debut solo album, All Things Must Pass. And thanks again to my guest, Clementine Moss, for such a great conversation. Man, every time I talk to Clem, I just feel a little bit better about humanity and the future. She's just a wonderful, spiritual person, and not to mention a freaking fantastic rock drummer. As I previously mentioned, Clem is also a spiritual counselor and an author. She recently published a book, From Bonham to Buddha and Back. You can check this out and pick up a copy of your own at clementinemoss.com or clemthegreat.com. Also, if you're interested in any of the books or albums that I've discussed in this episode or previous episodes, go to albumreview.net and pick up a copy of your own. Listen to all my podcast album reviews at albumreview.net by clicking on the podcast tab. They can also be heard where podcasts are available. Please follow the show on your preferred platform so you can get regular updates on new episodes. Also, if you guys would be so kind as to pop a quick review or rate the podcast, that helps move the needle and get the word out there. I do want to hear from you. You can email me your feedback, album review requests, and any questions you have to gpotters@albumreview.net. That's GPOTTERS @albumreview.net. If you'd like to get regular updates on reviews, interviews, products, and music news, go to the homepage and join the mailing list. Visit our YouTube page and stay tuned for updates on Instagram, Facebook, and that thing they call TikTok, which may or may not be here in a couple of years. You can find me on those platforms at albumreview.net. Okay, stay tuned for episode 2 coming up eventually of this 2-part review coming soon.
I want an Oompa Loompa now! Kenny!
Right, can it? Don't worry, Veruca. Be patient. God. All right, later. a trip down by the highway. Take 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 a trip down